So tonight, really the purpose is we want to go through a few things, or at least I want to go through a few things in my part of the presentation. Provide a little bit of context as to why this board and any board for that matter looks at an attendance boundary review or school boundary change. I want to look at a little bit at what the current situation is, so that'll help with some of the context. What do the current schools in the city of Oshawa look like? What are their enrollments? What are their utilizations, capacities? We'll talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that we used throughout this boundary review process, talk a little bit about the process itself, and then we'll finish off tonight looking at what the attendance area review committee and staff is going to recommend to the board of trustees. So to get started, I mean, the first thing we want to talk about is why boards do attendance areas, and there's really, there's several reasons, but there's a few main ones, and you'll see the first circle is highlighted in red in enrollment pressures. And what we mean when we're talking about enrollment pressures, our schools are built for a certain size. And at some point, enrollment may grow over that size and create pressures. You have portables, you have overcapacity. So that's a pretty common reason why a school board might look at a boundary review change is could they alleviate some of those enrollment pressures by doing a boundary change. Sometimes there's a new school that gets built. So you have to figure out what is that new school's boundary going to look like. That might be a reason you do a boundary review. Sometimes you just have a general imbalance in enrollment and you try to change boundaries to try to create more equity in enrollment around the review area or study area. In this case, the entire city of Oshawa. Sometimes it's due to program. So you might have a program that maybe is creating certain pressures in enrollment, or you might want to look at congregating a program. Again, a variety of reasons, but that's another reason why a board might do a boundary review. In this case, when we're looking at the reasons in the city of Oshawa, there pretty much all of them. I mean, we at some point, we have enrollment pressures at some schools, and we'll look at this in a minute. We have a new school in the secondary school, Monsignor Dwyer, that's going to be built. We have enrollment balances that we'll look at, and we have a French immersion program, and it also is causing some pressures at 2 of the 3 schools it's located in. When we look at, just for some context and some spatial awareness, what we're looking at now are all the schools that are involved in the review. So these are all the board's elementary schools, as well as the 2 secondary schools that are denoted in red here, and their actual school boundaries. So again, just so we have an understanding of where the schools are located, how big, how small their boundaries are, and where they are in the city of Oshawa. When we look here, we're looking at October 31st, 2022 enrollments by school and by grade. So again, this helps us understand some of the points I made a minute ago about why a board may do a boundary review. So when we look at the board's schools, both elementary and secondary across the city of Oshawa, we notice a couple of things. There's various sizes of schools. There's various sizes of enrollments. Some schools are operating a little bit below capacity. A lot of schools are operating quite above capacity. And as a whole, the board is operating above capacity. So there's definitely some enrollment pressures. There's some enrollment inequity, again, secondary schools as well. Like we said, there's 3 schools, and we'll look at these more closely in a second, that have dual track English and French immersion programs. Like I said, 2 of them have pretty high utilization rates. So there's, this kind of paints a picture for us in terms of enrollment, utilization, and capacity about why a board, in this case, this board in the city of Oshawa, might do a boundary review. This next slide is very similar to what we just looked at, but it helps point out some of the French immersion enrollment. So as I mentioned, right now, the board in the city of Oshawa has 3 dual track elementary schools, St. Christopher, St. Kateri, and St. Thomas. 2 of the 3 schools, as we looked at, are operating quite above capacity, 162 at Kateri, 156 at St. Christopher, St. Thomas pretty much at or a little slightly above capacity. And this column here, total FI or total French immersion, shows the amount of enrollment enrolled in French immersion. So 158 of the 541 at St. Christopher, around 250 of the 600 at St. Kateri, and about 130 of the 365 at St. Thomas, for a total of about 540 students elementary in the city of Oshawa. And this map, just again, thinking back about what we just looked at, we looked at the existing school boundaries and the school locations. This map basically puts that map as well as the utilization table we just looked at together. So we could understand, again, spatially, visually, where the utilization issues are, where the hotspots are. And basically anywhere you kind of see orange, yellow, darker red, those are the schools that have high utilization rates. Where you see green pretty much at capacity, lighter blue colors have some space. And this is 2021. This shows what it looks like 10 years from now. It doesn't get much better. Most of the schools that have pressures are going to continue to have pressures, or they're going to get worse. So before we get into some of the process, I just want the public to understand some assumptions that were carried forward as part of this analysis. So some givens were that St. Anne, so we just looked at St. Anne, it was also a high utilization school, had some enrollment pressures. It has been approved for an 8 classroom addition. So 184 spaces are going to be added to St. Anne. That's been approved for 2023, 2024. So that addition should alleviate some of the enrollment pressures there. Again, another given is that the board has been approved for a new Monsignor Dwyer Secondary School that's expected to open in the next couple of years. That is also a given. Another given is that the existing as well as the new Monsignor Paul Dwyer is going to start accommodating secondary French immersion students from the city of Ottawa or Oshawa. So they're currently bused out of the city. They will be accommodated at that school. Also, something important to be known is the recommendations we're going to speak about tonight. Some of them are contingent upon the opening date of the new Monsignor Paul Dwyer. So if that gets delayed for any reason, some of these recommendations are tied into that. And for ease of trying to understand some of these recommendations, we've tried to group them into some hopefully more focused categories. Boundary changes, program changes, grade structure changes, just so that we can, like I said, hopefully make a little bit more sense of what we're recommending and what we're talking about tonight. So I'm just going to take a second, maybe stop and Scott or Jim, see if there's any questions so far in the chat, anything we want to address.
Thanks, Jack. We've actually, a couple of questions have come in regarding French immersion, and we've posted those answers for the public to see what those questions and answers are. So no other questions at this time. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Scott. Okay, so we're going to continue on now. So we've touched a little bit, I think, on context, why boards look at boundary reviews, kind of what the situation is in the city of Oshawa and what prompted the board to start looking at the boundaries there and additional, some of the program and grade structures. Talk a little bit about the process. So it's been a process that's been, I guess, from initial discussions with the board and board staff going to the trustees to get approval to do this study. I think it's been about a year, maybe a little bit more than a year, but somewhere around that time. Committee, the board, as part of their boundary review process, forms committees that are made up of administration from the affected schools, as well as members of the community, parents or parent council members. So that was done. So a committee helped guide us through this process and helped us with feedback and to relay concerns of the community, and really acted as a sounding board, as ground truthing, as a conduit for us and the school communities. So committees were formed, presentations and workshops were held with the committees. I believe 4 in-person and virtual committee meetings were held in total. Surveys were provided to the committee members to try to garner feedback on the different topics we talked about, on the different options and scenarios that we analyzed. Helped us, garner some response in a good measured way, consistent way. We also had email opportunities for feedback, website opportunities for feedback, again, organic opportunities for feedback, hopefully talking to parents at kid drop off or at bus drop off, really any way that we can get feedback and get commentary, we were open to. In addition to the work with the committee, we also had public meetings open to anybody in the public. We had these at 3 of the schools in Oshawa. And the way the board constructed these public meetings were really in an open house or carousel type environment where board staff as well as myself were around. We had big poster boards and different information to help the community understand what we were looking at, what some of the issues are that we spoke about already tonight, and garnered some feedback. In addition, a lot of these materials, or pretty much all the materials we spoke about, were put on the board's website. We also did some videos for each school community explaining how they fit into this process and what some possible impacts were. So we hope the community feels like we do that we did our best to try to provide different varieties, different mediums of information to really get the word out and to get community feedback. In addition, throughout this, like I mentioned, there were a variety of scenarios and options explored. I mean, I feel like we looked at an exhaustive list of different scenarios and really took to heart, I think, the feedback that we received both from the public and the committee to basically digest all these scenarios down into what we think were 4, somewhat reasonable options to address some of the main issues that we thought were present as consultants and as staff, and we think, in some sense were relayed to us from the committee and the broader community as well. So from all these options, really, we narrowed it down to 4 main focus areas that I'll go through. The first one had to do with secondary feeder school alignments. So the way secondary schools work is that they have elementary schools that are directed to secondary schools, which we call feeder schools. So one thing that is evident, and this is probably evident to most people in the public, North Oshawa has been growing. It's a big driver of why we've been doing, or why we're looking at these boundary reviews. And that elementary growth is starting to and will eventually feed into secondary school as well. And so the projections show that when the new Dwyer is projected to open, it's likely to be at or over capacity. So we thought this was an opportunity to try to address some of those capacity or possible enrollment pressure and capacity issues. So one of the focus areas was, could we do something to alleviate some of that future enrollment pressure at Dwyer and use Parima that, as we'll see, has some space. So that's one focus area. The second thing, and we talked about this as an assumption or a given, was we know that the board's approved for this new Monsignor Paul Dwyer Catholic High School. And we also know that it's been approved as a grade 7 to 12 high school. So one thing that we have to address as part of this review is what grade 7 and 8s are going to attend this new grade 7 to 12 high school. So that's the next main focus area that we're going to talk about. We also know, as we looked at a couple of slides ago, that French immersion has been successful, and that's a great thing. But we also know that at 2 of the 3 schools, it's causing some significant enrollment pressures. So we think that we can do something to try to alleviate some of those enrollment pressures by addressing the French immersion program. In addition, we received a lot of feedback with regard to the French immersion program. So we thought that was an important third focus area. And again, while we were, because we were doing this in a citywide way, we thought also that there was some opportunity here to address a couple of the schools in central Oshawa through some boundary adjustments as well. And those schools I'm speaking about, at least initially in our early thought, was Sir Albert Love, St. Joseph, and St. John the 23rd. And we'll examine that in a couple of minutes and how that focus area has evolved as well. So maybe I'll just, again, stop, Scott, and see if there's anything that you want to stop for, any questions or anything like that.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, a couple of more questions have come in. Jody's just formulating a response to one of them. There's also another question that talks about some boundaries around St. Joseph's, Robert Love, which actually you're going to get to later on the presentation. So for that question, you'll the individual that put it in there, you'll hear about that in slides to come. So thanks,
Great. Perfect. Thanks, Scott. Okay, so we are going to now basically, using those 4 focus areas as a guide or a baseline or a reminder, we're going to go through what the final committee recommendations were. So the first one, going back to the first focus area I spoke about, that we think something could be done between Monsignor Paul Dwyer and Monsignor Parima to adjust some of the enrollment between the two schools. So the recommendation is that Sir Albert Love, which currently feeds into Monsignor Paul Dwyer, the recommendation is for it to feed into Monsignor John Parima. It will remain a K-8 school at this time, pending a school survey. So the feeder schools that currently feed into Prima is a grade 7 to 12 school. Its feeder schools are K-6. However, in this recommendation, it would be K-8, like it says, pending a school survey to see if there's a desire to move to a K-6 model. This is recommended to be implemented for grade 8s that would be graduating in June of 2024. So that would be recommendation number 1. Recommendation number 2 has to do with that second focus area that I spoke about. We know that, like we said, the new Monsignor Paul Dwyer is approved as a grade 7 to 12 school. So we examined a variety of scenarios of which schools grade 7 and 8s could be directed to Monsignor Paul Dwyer, with a focus being number 1, can we address some of the enrollment pressures at some of the North Oshawa elementary schools? And number 2, we wanted it to be in a reasonable distance, at least as close as possible, to the new Monsignor Paul Dwyer. So again, we looked at a variety of scenarios. Ultimately, what the committee landed on to recommend to the Board of Trustees was for St. Kateri Tekakwitha's grade 7 and 8s to be directed to the new Monsignor Paul Dwyer, both English and French immersion grade 7 and 8s, so all grade 7 and 8s. In addition, St. Thomas Aquinas, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in this recommendation in a minute, but all grade 7 and 8 students, which would be French immersion only, because the English already go to Monsignor Parima, all grade 7 and 8 French immersion also directed to Dwyer. So in essence, the recommendation is for all French immersion grade 7 and 8s to be directed to the new secondary school, as well as the grade 7 and 8 English track students from St. Kateri. In addition to this, actually, Scott, do you want me to just stop and see if there's any questions with regard to these first 2 recommendations?
Not at the moment, but I'm sure as people have a chance to kind of contemplate what's up on the screen there, they might post some questions shortly.
Perfect. Okay.
And again, just a reminder to people,
yeah.
If you're making notes, there is at the end of the presentation, we've got a communication slide. So there's a QR code. You'll be able to, formulate your responses and put them in writing through to the various communication methodologies at the end of this presentation. So.
Perfect. Thanks again, Scott. So in addition, there's a couple of other things that I want to mention with regard to this recommendation. The first one is that there's some interim measures. So this obviously can't happen. This is one of the ones we talked about in our assumptions. This one is dependent on the new Monsignor Paul Dwyer opening. So it's contingent on that's the timing. However, we know that, we looked at enrollments at Kateri and we highlighted that as having some significant enrollment pressures because of growth. Growth is sustained and expected to continue. So in the interim, until the new Paul Dwyer is built, there will be a student cap implemented at St. Kateri Tekakwitha that would occur for regular track in grades SK to grade 8 and in grades 2 to 8 for French immersion. So basically, any new students that would be registered at St. Kateri Tekakwitha in those grade structures that I just mentioned would be directed to St. John Bosco. Again, until the new Paul Dwyer opens, the grade 7 and 8s can be removed and create some additional space at Kateri. So that would be recommendation number 2. The third bucket that we talked about is dealing with French immersion. So just as a reminder, I mentioned that the board currently has 3 dual track French immersion, really a north, central, and south, or the central and south are sort of a central west south. And 2 of those 3 schools are well over capacity. So as we went through different iterations with the community regarding French immersion, there were a couple of themes that started to emerge, both through the committee work, through the public meetings, through the surveys and additional feedback, is that there was a desire to see single track French immersion in the city of Oshawa. So we did explore that as a possible one possible scenario. Explored single track French immersion at what would be the old Dwyer once the new Dwyer opens. It would be one facility for the entire city of Oshawa. That option that we put out to the community, again, there was some acceptance of it, but there was a lot of feedback regarding travel times. Just that the city is getting bigger and busier and more populated, and one facility would result in potentially some really long travel times for some residents in Oshawa, especially those in the north, and cause a lot of busing as well. And there was, while there was still a preference for single track French immersion, there was more of a preference for two single track French immersion facilities, one in the north and one in the south. However, as we explored various options to try to make that work, we didn't have, at least in our opinion, committee's opinion, public's opinion, a viable facility in the north because of the enrollment pressures we were speaking about, that we thought could be something sustainable that would work well as a single track north option. So again, we tried to carry through at least on the theme of having a north and south facility, but because of the issues I mentioned, the feeling was they had to remain as dual track facilities. But again, we wanted to try to congregate French immersion resources, and through this recommendation, if we could alleviate at least one of those French immersion utilization issues, we thought that would be beneficial. So ultimately, the recommendation that's going to the Board of Trustees is that there's two new French immersion boundaries that are created, and we'll look at this on a map in a second, a north boundary and a south boundary, and that two schools, the two of the current dual track French immersion schools, St. Kateri and St. Thomas, be designated as the dual track French immersion facilities for Oshawa. In addition, by doing that, there's a few other things that come out of that scenario. Because St. Christopher's enrollment is reduced by removing the French immersion program, it now becomes a K-8 elementary school, regular track, and it can have some of its boundary adjusted with Sir Albert Love and St. Joseph to reduce some of the enrollment at those two schools. In addition, a portion of English enrollment from St. Thomas, to create some room for the additional French immersion students, can be sent east to St. Hedwig. As you recall, St. Hedwig was one of the schools we identified that had some surplus space and some lower utilization, so that would improve the utilization rates at that school as well. So ultimately, we would have, and then as we said in the previous, ultimately, once the new Monsignor Paul Dwyer opens, the grade 7 and 8 students from both St. Thomas and St. Kateri would attend that Paul Dwyer. So ultimately, we would be creating, under this recommendation, when it's all fully implemented, two grade JK to 6 dual track schools, one in the north at St. Kateri, one in the south at St. Thomas. And this shows you what the boundaries would look like. So on the left map, it's what the proposed new French immersion boundaries would look like. So the blue in St. Kateri, the green St. Thomas, and the black lines that you see are what the existing boundaries look like. So this black line that I'm outlining is St. Christopher's current boundary, and you can see how it would be split or melded into the two proposed boundaries. On the elementary English track side, you can see the proposed St. Christopher change here. So it's currently at this black line here. It can move east into St. Joseph and Sir Albert Love, like we said, to alleviate some pressures there. And you can see here where my cursor is, St. Thomas's boundary would actually shrink down. St. Hedwig would take a portion of it, its English track enrollment. And then to finish off the recommendations, the last one, as I mentioned, again, if we think of sort of the fourth focus area or the fourth bucket, was dealing with some of the schools in central Oshawa. So when we looked at some of the enrollments there, again, St. Joseph was one enrollment that still had some fairly high utilization. In addition, when we looked at the boundaries, we realized that Sir Albert Love, again, this area that I'm running through with my cursor, this existing boundary is part of Sir Albert Love. It's what we call a satellite area because it's not necessarily a congruent part of the boundary. So what we had tried to do as part of this, at least the original recommendation, was to see if we can make this satellite area a part of another school, thereby reducing enrollment a little bit at Sir Albert Love and having the opportunity or the ability to take some of this area of St. Joseph, send it south to Sir Albert Love, thereby adjusting some of the enrollment at St. Joseph as well. In addition, most of this area is in walkable distance to Sir Albert Love. Ultimately, through feedback from the community, there was acceptance of doing something with this satellite area, but we heard pretty clearly that there would be a greater desire to attach it to St. Joseph. It's closer, it seems to make more sense. There's some association with this community. So ultimately the recommendation, this fourth recommendation, would be for a boundary change between St. Joseph and Sir Albert Love. So this satellite area I referred to, recommended to be part of St. Joseph. This part of St. Joseph would be part of Sir Albert Love. And in addition, this map also shows the proposed changes that we talked about as part of recommendation 3, where St. Christopher would take in some of St. Joseph and some of Sir Albert Love. So again, we're going to get into all the information by school, but I just want to stop for a second, see if there's anything from Scott on the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So there was a couple of questions about when new dryers expected to open. We've posted that in there, that it's anticipated for September of 2026. There's also a couple of questions here around the implementation for St. Kateri with the interim measures. So just to clarify that, the first question talks about is this the interim measure only for English track or French immersion track students registering into St. Kateri? So in that case, it would be for both, but there would be caps on them. So our French immersion program would be capped in per grade. Our English track, the same thing. We wouldn't allow new students to register in from grades 1 to 8. It would just be for our JK program for new students coming in to the school. There's also a question again around the interim movement of 7 and 8s from Kateri to Bosco could cause even more over enrollment. So just for clarification, the interim measure is meant to any new students that would be new to the area, the St. Kateri boundary, would be sent as a holding school to St. John Bosco. So basically what we would be doing is we'd be capping St. Kateri with the capacity that it's currently at. So there'd be no need for further portables on that site. But we would continue to allow kindergarten programs coming in, which would continue to fill up. Basically, as grade 8 students graduate, you have your JK coming in at the other end. And then on the French program, it would be your grades 1 through 8. It would be capped per grade at that school. Just trying to see. There's a few more questions that have come in, so we'll endeavor to review them and put responses back into the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Okay. So next couple of minutes, we're going to go through how these recommendations I spoke about impact each individual school. So that just for the benefit of those watching tonight and wanting to know, what does this mean? I understand what this means for the city of Oshawa. I understand what this means as a board whole, but what does as a board as a whole, but what does this mean to the numbers at my school? So we're going to go through those and in a couple of different areas or again, focus areas. We're going to look at secondary, we're going to look at status quo, we're going to look at those schools that kind of have a minimal impact, and then we're going to look at a couple of the schools that have a little bit of a greater impact. So starting out with secondary, so one of the recommendations we spoke about is that we know that the new Monsignor Paul Dwyer, when it opens, is going to be a grade 7 to 12 school. If we look at the screen at the top and sort of the bottom portion of that table at the top, We know that it's going to open with a proposed capacity of 1,061 grade 7 to 12, based on the enrollment scenario that we're looking at with the grade 7 to 12s, like we said, for Kateri and St. Thomas attending Monsignor Paul Dwyer. It looks like enrollment will be around 1170. So operating at around 110% utilization. So pretty similar to what the existing secondary school is operating at in terms of utilization. However, as we spoke about before, we also know that enrollment at Dwyer is going to increase practically when it opens, and pretty sustainable as far as we can see in our projections. So again, going back to that first recommendation, by looking at Sir Albert Love, we know that we can reduce enrollment at Dwyer. And the next thing we want to look at is the bottom table. We see that Prima is operating around 65% capacity. So 563 enrollment compared to 862 capacity. So we also know that that school has room and has some surplus space that it could accept some additional enrollment feeding into it, and alleviate some of the pressures at Monsignor Paul Dwyer. So that's kind of showing the impacts of that grade 7 to 12 change, as well as the recommended feeder school change at the two secondary schools. The next thing we want to quickly highlight is there's a couple of schools that aren't part of any recommendation. So for those school communities, just to show you what the status quo numbers look like. So Monsignor Philip Coffey, not part of any of the recommendations, pretty much operating. It's the school in the extreme south of Oshawa, and it's pretty much operating at capacity. St. John the 23rd, it was evaluated as part of some recommendations and some scenarios. Ultimately, again, through digesting some of the public and committee feedback, it was ultimately recommended to stay status quo. It's operating a little bit under capacity, around 75% utilization. The next areas we're going to look at are St. Anne. We want to look at this a bit separately, just because I recall, or if you recall at the beginning, again, as part of some of the assumptions as part of this study, we knew that St. Anne was approved for an 8 classroom addition. So again, looking at the new capacity of the school assumed to be 596. When that addition opens, it brings utilization down. Again, it's not down to 100%. It's still overutilized. High growth area in North Oshawa brings it down to a much more reasonable 120%. We talked a minute ago, and Scott talked a little bit about this with regard to capping and using St. John Bosco as a holding student. So again, really, status quo in a sense in terms of recommendations, because no boundary changes or no grade structure changes recommended at this school, but it will be used as a potential holding school to accommodate new growth. Again, as an interim measure until the new Dwyer is open, and also as an interim measure, I think important to note that ultimately, part of this solution here is a new elementary school in North Oshawa. The board already has a site identified, and that's ultimately the plan here. So it's also an interim measure until that new North Oshawa elementary school gets built and opened. And then in terms of some of the boundary changes, so we spoke about this Sir Albert Love St. Joseph change, the Sir Albert Love satellite area going to St. Joseph, as well as a portion of St. Joseph moving south to Sir Albert Love. Not a huge impact in terms of utilization rates. At Sir Albert Love, enrollment stays practically the same. 294 status quo compared to 298 under the proposed solution, pretty much at capacity. At St. Joseph goes down a little bit more because there's a greater number of students. If you recall, part of this was St. Christopher capturing some enrollment from these two schools. So it captures a little bit more from St. Joseph. So it actually reduces utilization at St. Joseph by about 10%, down to about 126% from 136%. With regard to St. Christopher and St. Hedwig, so again, two things here. So St. Christopher, under the recommendations, its French immersion program would be removed from that school and dispersed to St. Kateri and St. Thomas. And in addition, like we just talked about, it would pick some English enrollment up or boundary up from Sir Albert Love and St. Joseph. So enrollment at St. Christopher, currently one of the higher utilized schools at 156%, multiple portables, we would bring that down quite significantly to about 120%, enrollment down to just below 420. At St. Hedwig, again, a reminder of the recommendation was as part of this related to this French immersion, St. Christopher portion of French immersion down to St. Thomas to create some additional room at St. Thomas. A portion of English would go to St. Hedwig. So we see that St. Hedwig goes from 75% utilized, one of the lowest schools in terms of utilization, up to about 100 or a little over 100%. And then the last couple of recommendations, again, dealing with the 7 and 8 primarily here. So St. Kateri Tekakwitha currently at just over 600 enrollment. Again, I think the highest utilized school at 162%, based on the recommendations of removing the 7 and 8s and sending them to Dwyer, it would reduce enrollment or utilization there to about 135% or just over 500 enrollment. And then the last one, in terms of the St. Thomas community, again, it would take in French immersion students or a portion of them from St. Christopher. A portion of English enrollment would move east to St. Hedwig. And upon opening the new Dwyer, the grades 7 and 8s would be directed to the new Dwyer. So it would become a K-6 dual track English French immersion school. All those changes, enrollment would be slightly above what it is now, still well utilized at a little over 100%, 106%. So this last slide, before I turn it back over to Scott, just summarizes all those slides that we just went through by school. It shows you the 2 recommended dual track French immersion schools highlighted in blue. It shows you what the status quo or do nothing utilization rates are based on 2022 enrollments. And then it shows you what those utilization rates are based on the recommendations we just spoke about tonight. And this I'm just going to quickly review. This, again, as a reminder, is what the 2 new proposed French immersion boundaries would look like. And then this final map incorporates all the changes that would be recommended through the English track changes. So again, just to review quickly, this portion of St. Christopher would be expanded into St. Joseph and Sir Robert Love. This portion of St. Joseph's would move into Sir Robert Love. This satellite boundary of Sir Robert Love would be attached to St. Joseph. This portion of St. Thomas would move into St. Hedwig. So that's it in terms of any or all the recommendations that are being provided to the Board of Trustees. So I'm going to turn it back over to Scott, and he's going to walk you through some next steps and some communication protocols. Thanks for your attention thus far.
All right, thank you, Jack. And a few people have asked if it's going to be recorded. The presentation has been recorded. We'll be posting it if not tomorrow, by Monday, onto the board's website. The next steps here. So we have we're going to have a special board meeting for the trustees on June the 15th. Basically, that'll give them a much broader presentation to be able to sort of review all the material that this whole process we've gone through our committee consultations, our community consultations, and where our recommendation started and where we've ended up based on those consultations. That way, when they come to their last board meeting of the school year on June the 19th, which is a Monday, the presentation at that meeting will be basically the report with the recommendations. So they'll have had time to absorb the information and be able to make that decision. That's also the time when any public delegations will be able to be made. There is a delegation process that's on our board website, and I'll just remind anybody that's considering a delegation that you do need to provide. There's a form with a bunch of information that's required on there, and it needs to be submitted 5 days before the meeting itself. I don't know, do we have, is there one more there, Jack? Slide there, that might be okay.
Can you maybe, I'll switch slides. Just something that popped into my head that I forgot to mention with regard to the Sir Albert Love St. Joseph recommendation. Can you just explain to the public that the part of the recommendation is also that it's for not existing students, but for new students? I think I forgot to mention that in the recommendation.
Yeah, so I think that's come up in a couple of, there's a few questions around, especially it's St. Kateri regarding if this is happening before Dwyer opens, that will it impact the registrations? It is meant for new students to the community. So in the boundary, the current St. Kateri boundary, any students that move into that boundary, they would be directed to St. John Bosco for regular track. And if there's room in grades 1 to 8 for French immersion, they would be accepted into the French immersion program at St. Kateri. But again, that would have to be a capped per grade program. And obviously there'd be considerations given to siblings that are already in the school. Those would be things that would be reviewed by the school itself. And this is our delegation process. I'm just looking for any other questions. We've been trying to respond. We've answered 12 of those questions. Some were more personal in nature, so we responded directly to the individual versus posting them. And the ones that are remaining seem to be generally around, that who it will impact. So if we're registering to the school, see another one here. It looks like we've captured most of the questions. Again, if they haven't been answered, we will be able to bring these off the presentation at the end, but I would definitely encourage everyone to be able to go onto the website. Actually, Jack, if you give me the control back, because I don't think the communication slide is on here, right? So. So while Jack's looking for that slide or providing that back to me, I did just want to sort of summarize just with sort of a last comments here, just to thank, basically thank all the Oshawa communities for their participation and understanding as we've worked through this difficult process. We know that these decisions aren't easy, and we hope that what we've done here is that we've listened to the community through our public consultation process, getting out to the schools, and that the changes that we've made that you've heard this evening reflect many of those comments, and we've tried to minimize the impact on the families in our Catholic schools. As we know, that's the goal of any of these boundary or program changes, is to have the least impact on our families that are in our schools. But also we know that these are decisions that we have to make, because if we don't, we're impacting families that are already in schools that are, 12 portables, multiple traffic issues, lots of challenges. So by doing these changes, we hope to position ourselves in Oshawa to alleviate much of that pressure and put us in a strong position to make business cases to the Ministry of Education for future schools and additions in our Catholic school communities. And so I'm going to share my screen here. Jack, can you see that?
Yes, it's up.
Perfect. Okay. So I'll just leave that up as we for a couple of minutes and see if there's any further questions coming in. Again, encouraging everybody to use the QR code that's on the screen or go through our website to pull down any information that might be there. And there's also a feedback link within that website. We've also got our email address and phone number, and we've responded to, I believe we're upwards of 90 questions since we began this process, and those questions have been responded to each of those individuals. The comments and questions that are put on our public website actually do make up the final document that we present to our Board of Trustees. So the names and the communities that are being the questions are coming from are posted on there. We obviously don't put any personal information in there, but that'll make up part of the public document and part of that decision. I see a couple of thank yous for the presentation this evening. The changes, somebody's asked about the changes. So the changes will be in effect at different schools at different times or different So again, I'd encourage you to go back and check in on those. And I don't see any other questions. So yeah, there is a question there about specifically to the interim measures. So there is measures that we can put in. There's very few measures that we would put in place for September of 2023. But one of them is that we can redirect any new registrants. So that would be a family moving into the St. Kateri boundary. They could be directed. So that is something that's being proposed to the Board of Trustees at the June meeting. But again, a lot of the other decisions would be out at least 1 year. And for some of these decisions, the implementation might take place over multiple years as we legacy a program in or out of a school. And that basically means that if we're taking a French program, we might legacy out the grades 6, 7, and 8s, or allow them to graduate out of a school, and the other grades would be moved. So those are some of the decisions that'll be put into our final recommendations to the board.
God, if I can
Yeah,
quickly interject, just I saw a question about how do I know if my kids are in the boundary for their school.
Oh.
Another thing we forgot to mention, and what that'll be up on the board website in the next, hopefully day or so, is there'll be a link to an interactive map that'll show you the scenarios, and what parents can do is you can go into this interactive map, you put in your address, and then you can basically click through the different scenarios that we went through tonight, and it'll show you based on each scenario where your child would go based on that. So that should be out if you check the board website. I think hopefully in the next, I think it's pretty much ready to go. So I would assume that it'll be ready to go by tomorrow, I think.
Thank you, Jack. So yeah, the question there's, would St. Kateri still accept new JK? Yeah, so we said earlier that so at grade 8s, they're graduating out of St. Kateri. We obviously need to continue to keep that school stable. So we would have a registrations for JK coming into the school. So to confirm, no St. Kateri students will be going to Old Dwyer. That is correct. Will the 7 and 8s be separated from the 9 to 12 by way of schedule? So in the planning of the new Dwyer school, it's planned to be a 3-story 7 to 12, and we are looking at having sort of a second floor end of the school where all the classrooms would be designated for the 7 and 8s. And obviously there would still be recess and lunch times that would need to be scheduled in and around the bell changes of the secondary. I think that covers them all. So again, thank you for everybody for coming out this evening and providing comments. Make sure you put any of those comments into our at our board website. Put those in there so we can respond and get that part of the public record. Again, thank you everyone, and have a good evening.